The smoke from the last shot had barely settled over the peak of Mount Gunib, as the history of the Caucasian War reached its thunderous, paradoxical end. A quarter-century of bloody slaughter, an entire generation of Russian soldiers who fell in its impassable gorges, decades during which his name alone, Shamil, inspired a mystical terror and struck fear into the hearts of imperial viceroys. All of it was to end here and now, in mud and humiliation. A gray, weary, but unbroken lion, the aging Imam descended the mountain, ready to accept death at the hands of his conquerors. With him were only a few dozen Murids, the last faithful warriors of a once formidable army that had held a colossal empire at bay. Waiting below was Prince Alexander Baryatinsky, the field marshal, the commander-in-chief, the man who had spent years trapping this beast. By all the laws of war and hatred, Baryatinsky should have stripped the prisoner of his weapons, forced him to his knees, and savored his triumph. But the unthinkable happened. As Shamil approached, the Russian field marshal, an aristocrat, a confidant of the emperor, did something that stunned all who watched. He courteously, almost reverently, greeted his prisoner, shook his hand, and spoke words that became the prologue to the war's greatest paradox. "I am very glad, Imam, that you are finally here. I have waited for you for a long time." In this gesture, there was no victor's malice, but a profound respect for a fallen enemy. From that moment, the story was not of a capture, but the legend of the honored guest. A legend that still begs the question: how could a man who was the embodiment of the devil to Russia be granted almost divine reverence by his enemies? The answer lies not in the last day of the war, but in the world of fire and steel that forged this titan. To understand the phenomenon of Shamil, one must travel back in time to the Caucasus of the early 19th century, a geopolitical fault line where the tectonic plates of three great empires collided. This was not merely a region, but a boiling cauldron where dozens of peoples, languages, beliefs, and codes of honor had simmered for centuries. From the south, the fading but still influential Ottoman and Persian empires pressed upon this world, seeing the mountain peoples as their natural allies and fellow believers, a buffer against the relentless expansion of their northern neighbor. From the north, like a glacier, crept the Russian Empire, driven by its idea of a civilizing mission and the strategic need to secure its southern frontiers. For St. Petersburg, the Caucasus was both a wound and a key to dominating the region. In this clash of civilizations, the old mountain adats, the ancient laws and customs, began to crack. The authority of local khans and princes, often willing to compromise with the Russians, no longer satisfied the passionate elements of society. In the thin mountain air, thick with the scent of gunpowder and the love of freedom, a new, all-consuming idea began to form, an idea capable of uniting warring clans and channeling their fury into a single current. This idea was Muridism, a Sufi teaching of spiritual perfection that on Caucasian soil took on a radical, military-political character. Its preachers called for Ghazavat, a holy war against the infidels, but primarily for the purification of society itself from pagan remnants and a return to the purity of Islam, to a life under Sharia law. This was not just a rebellion. It was a spiritual revolution that demanded a new type of leader. Not a prince who traded loyalty, but a spiritual guide, an imam whose authority came not from gold, but from Allah himself. And at this very moment in history, in the small Dagestani village of Gimry, fate was preparing a man to step onto the stage, a man destined to become the embodiment of this fire. In the year 1797, in the Avar village of Gimry, Lost among the harsh rocks of Dagestan, a boy named Ali was born to the family of a free commoner, Dengau Magomed. The child, however, was so sickly and frail that according to mountain custom, it was decided to change his name and fate. He was renamed Shamil. This name, meaning the all-encompassing, proved to be prophetic. From childhood, he possessed seemingly incompatible traits. On one hand, he had incredible physical strength and endurance, which he honed to perfection through grueling training. He could leap over a stream with a bull on his shoulders and practice with his saber for hours until his hands were raw. He was a born warrior, his body forged in the harsh crucible of Caucasian life. Yet, unlike many of his peers who saw valor only in raids and brute force, Shamil had an insatiable thirst for knowledge. He did not merely memorize the surahs of the Quran. He delved into the depths of Islamic theology, philosophy, law, and Arabic grammar. His mind was as sharp and dangerous a weapon as his blade. While other young men dreamed of glory on the battlefield, Shamil spent his days and nights in conversation with the greatest scholars of Dagestan, absorbing the wisdom of generations. This duality, the might of a barbarian and the intellect of a sage, became the foundation of his personality. He was not a simple-minded highlander blinded by fanaticism. He was a thinker, a strategist, a man capable not only of leading warriors, but of articulating for them a great purpose, of shaping the wild energy of the mountains into the strict framework of ideology and statehood. It was this combination of qualities that later allowed him to do what no one before him had managed: to subordinate the anarchy of the mountains to a single will and transform scattered tribes into the unified army of a theocratic state. Figures of such magnitude as Shamil always give birth to legends, which intertwine so closely with reality that it becomes impossible to separate one from the other. One of the most significant stories, passed down by word of mouth throughout the Caucasus, is linked to his childhood and became a kind of prologue to his great mission. It is said that at the age of 7, the boy fell so gravely ill that no one believed he would recover. He lay motionless, his body burning with fever, and the village elders were already preparing for his funeral. His mother, Patimat, in desperation, took an action unheard of in mountain traditions, but full of mystical power. She made a sacred vow. If the Almighty spared her son's life, she would dedicate him to the service of God and the struggle for the faith. Furthermore, as the legend goes, she symbolically gave him away as charity, as if buying him back from the angel of death. And a miracle occurred. The next day, Shamil opened his eyes, the fever broke, and he began to recover rapidly. For the mountain people whose consciousness was deeply mythological, this event was not just a fortunate coincidence but a clear sign, a divine omen. From that moment on, Shamil was seen as marked, chosen. This story became an integral part of his aura, his divine grace. It explained his future invulnerability in battle, his incredible escape at Gimry, his ability to lead men. He was not just a leader. He was a man whose life had been prayed for from the heavens for a great purpose. This myth, which he himself may not have created but never refuted, worked for him better than any army. It created a sense of predestination, of the fatal inevitability of his rise. The enemies who fought him were not fighting just a man, but a living legend, a warrior protected by God himself. And this gave his figure that epic, almost supernatural dimension that so amazed and captivated even his adversaries. The forge that shaped the unbreakable character of the future Imam was his youth and apprenticeship, spent under the guidance of great Sufi masters and in the shadow of his first spiritual leader, Ghazi Muhammad. It was during this period that Shamil transformed from a gifted young man into a person of iron will and crystal-clear purpose. His main teacher was Jamaluddin of Kazikumuk, one of the most revered sages in Dagestan. Under his tutelage, Shamil delved into the subtleties of the Naqshbandi Sufi path, which demanded of its followers not only the external observance of rituals, but also the deepest internal discipline, a constant struggle against one's passions, pride, and ego. This was not mere education. It was a total transformation of personality. The asceticism he subjected himself to was almost inhuman. He slept on the bare ground, restricted his food, and spent nights in prayer and meditation. This spiritual practice burned from his soul everything superfluous: fear, doubt, and the desire for worldly goods. He learned to subordinate his powerful body to his even more powerful spirit. Simultaneously, he grew closer to Ghazi Muhammad, his childhood friend, who was the first to declare Ghazavat and become the first Imam of Dagestan. Their relationship was complex, full of friendship and hidden rivalry. Ghazi Muhammad was a fiery orator, a charismatic leader who could ignite a crowd, but he lacked strategic depth and organizational talent. Shamil, being more reserved and thoughtful, saw his friend's weaknesses and learned from his mistakes. He was the first Imam's shadow, his chief advisor, and his bravest warrior. This tandem, fire and steel, preacher and strategist, became the driving force of the nascent Murid movement. It was in these trials, in the combination of harsh mysticism and bloody military practice, that the unique alloy that became Imam Shamil was forged. Fanatical in his faith, yet cold and calculating in battle. Merciless to the enemies of the faith, yet capable of deep compassion. An ascetic who despised luxury, yet sought absolute power in the name of his idea. The baptism by fire, the moment that transformed the ascetic scholar into a living legend, was the siege of his native village of Gimry by Russian troops under General Rosen in October of 1832. This event was both a tragedy and the birth of a myth. Gimry, where the first Imam, Ghazi Muhammad, had taken refuge with his best Murids, including Shamil, was surrounded by superior forces. After a furious assault, the village was taken. Russian soldiers combed through the smoking ruins, finishing off the remaining defenders. Ghazi Muhammad, clutching the Quran in one hand and his saber in the other, died in an unequal fight. It seemed the Murid movement was finished. Shamil, with a handful of remaining warriors, was cornered in one of the defensive towers. There was no escape. Realizing that captivity was worse than death, he made a decision that would enter the annals of military history. He called upon his comrades to die with honor, breaking through the enemy ranks, and he was the first to charge. What happened next is described by eyewitnesses as something supernatural. Like a berserker, Shamil leaped from a high ledge of the tower directly into a crowd of Russian soldiers. Legend says that in mid-air he cut one down. Upon landing, he pierced another and began to carve a path through a dense wall of bayonets. His chest was pierced by a bayonet with such force that the tip exited his back. Any other man would have been killed instantly, but Shamil, gathering his last strength, is said to have grabbed the bayonet, pulled it from his wound, killed the soldier, and leaping over a wall of bodies, vanished into the night. The Russians were certain he was mortally wounded and would inevitably die in the mountains. But he survived. He was found unconscious by shepherds, and for many months he battled death, healing the terrible wound. This miraculous escape, this second birth, transformed him from a simple companion of the Imam into a figure of mystical stature. He became a man whom neither bullet nor bayonet could touch, a warrior blessed by the heavens. This story, which spread throughout the Caucasus, became his greatest asset, legitimizing his right to power and instilling in his followers an unshakable faith in his divine mission. Behind the 25-year epic of the Caucasian War, behind the roar of cannons and the clash of sabers, lay Shamil's deep, almost metaphysical motivation, which was often overlooked by his opponents, who saw in him only the fanatical leader of savage tribes. His true goal, his secret passion and life's work, was not simply to drive the Russians from Caucasian soil. That was merely a tactical objective. His strategic, all-consuming dream was to build an imamate, an ideal theocratic state based exclusively on the laws of Sharia. He envisioned the Caucasus not just as free, but as righteous. In his worldview, the Russian invasion was not only an act of military aggression, but also a source of corruption, an ignorance that was decaying mountain society. The Russians brought with them not only bayonets but also vodka, corruption, and alien laws and customs that undermined age-old foundations. Shamil, however, sought to create a utopia, a society of total justice, where there would be no place for old pagan adats, the tyranny of princes, or the blood feuds that had torn the Caucasus apart for centuries. In his imamate, all would be equal before God and his law. This project required absolute total power, and Shamil, being a deeply religious man, had no doubt in his right to that power. He saw himself not as a conqueror, but as an instrument in the hands of the Almighty, a surgeon who must, with fire and sword, cut out the ulcers from the body of his people to save their soul. This inner conviction in his own righteousness was the source of his incredible strength and inflexibility. He could not compromise with Russia, because that would mean compromising with unbelief, betraying his great dream. This is why he was so ruthless towards those highlanders who refused to submit to him. In his eyes, they were not just political opponents, but apostates who had betrayed divine law. Understanding this deep, religious political motivation is the key to unlocking his character, and paradoxically, one of the reasons his enemies eventually came to respect him. They saw that they were fighting not a bandit, but a sovereign, albeit a hostile one, acting in the name of a great idea. After assuming the title of the third Imam following the death of Hamzat Bek, Shamil faced a task that seemed impossible. The Caucasus was a patchwork of hundreds of independent and often warring societies, clans, and tribes. The concept of a unified nation was absent, and the main law was the unwritten adat. Ancient customs, central among which was the blood feud, which had poisoned the lives of the highlanders for centuries and made any lasting union impossible. Shamil understood that to fight a regular imperial army, he needed not a band of raiders, but a single monolithic organism, subject to iron discipline. And so, he began his war not against the Russians, but against his own people, or rather, against their age-old prejudices. His main weapon was Sharia law. He declared the adats a relic of paganism, and by the force of his authority, began to replace them with a single code of Islamic laws for all. This was a true revolution. He forbade blood feuds, introducing instead a system of blood money or judicial proceedings under the control of qadis he appointed. He established strict punishments for theft, drunkenness, and moral transgressions. This provoked fierce resistance from many influential clans and elders whose power was based precisely on the adats. Shamil had to literally carve a path for the new order with fire and sword. He mercilessly executed the disobedient, burned villages that refused to accept Sharia and relocated entire communities. His methods were brutal but effective. Gradually, he broke the back of the old clan system and, on its ruins, built a new structure, the imamate. He divided the territories under his control into districts, or naibdoms, and placed his most loyal and capable followers at their head. These naibs held full military and administrative power, but were accountable directly to him. Thus, from the chaos of feuds and anarchy, he molded a centralized, militarized state, cemented by a single ideology and a single will, his will. The state created by Shamil in the mountains of Chechnya and Dagestan was a unique phenomenon for its time, a true military theocracy that grew in the midst of a hostile environment. The imamate was not just a territory of resistance, but a fully fledged, though unrecognized, state organism with all the necessary attributes. Shamil, proving himself a brilliant administrator, built a streamlined and surprisingly effective system of governance. All power was concentrated in his hands as the imam, the spiritual and secular leader. Subordinate to him was the Divan Khana, or state council, composed of the most authoritative naibs and scholars, which functioned as a government and the highest judicial body. The territory of the imamate was divided into more than 30 naibdoms, each required to provide a certain number of warriors and pay taxes to the common treasury, known as the Baitul Mal. Taxes were collected mainly in kind: grain, livestock, and cloth. Shamil introduced the strictest accounting and control over expenditures, punishing embezzlers with death. A postal service was created, allowing the imam to transmit orders to the most remote corners of his domain in the shortest possible time. But his main achievement was the creation of a regular army. In addition to the general militia, which was assembled in case of a major war, Shamil had a corps of murtazeks, a personal guard, fanatically devoted to him. He paid special attention to artillery. Understanding that it was impossible to counter Russian fortresses without cannons, he organized foundries in the villages of Vedeno and Dargo, where captive Russian engineers and local craftsmen cast guns. Although this artillery was inferior in quality to the Russian, the very fact of its existence spoke to the scale of his ambitions. He even tried to establish his own production of gunpowder and rifles. This complex mechanism, operating under a total blockade and continuous warfare, evoked astonishment and grudging respect from his enemies. The Russian generals saw that they were fighting not an amorphous mass of rebels, but an organized force, an enemy state created by the will of one man. Shamil's military genius was most brilliantly demonstrated in his tactics of guerrilla warfare, which he elevated to a high art, turning the highlanders' main weakness, the lack of a regular army, into their greatest strength. He understood perfectly that in an open-field battle, his militia would be inevitably crushed by Russian infantry and artillery. Therefore, he imposed his own kind of war on the empire, a war without a front line, without decisive battles, a war of attrition in the heart of his impregnable fortress. The mountains. His greatest ally was the landscape itself. Narrow gorges, dense forests, sheer cliffs, and secret paths known only to the locals. Russian expeditionary columns entering the mountains found themselves in a death trap. Shamil avoided frontal assaults. His tactics were built on surprise, speed, and elusiveness. Small detachments of Murids, like ghosts, would appear from nowhere, unleash a hail of fire on the stretched-out column from commanding heights, create blockades, destroy bridges, and then vanish just as suddenly, dissolving into the forests. A particular art was the creation of rings of fire, where Russian units were lured deep into gorges, after which all exits were blocked, and a methodical slaughter of the trapped soldiers would begin. The pinnacle of these tactics was the Dargo expedition of 1845, when a 20,000-strong detachment, commanded by the viceroy of the Caucasus himself, Prince Vorontsov, attempted to take the capital of the Imamate. Shamil allowed the Russians to reach their goal, burned the village of Dargo himself, and retreated. On the way back, the exhausted, hungry, and demoralized Russian army entered a living hell. Every step, every turn in the gorge brought death. The highlanders attacked relentlessly, giving them not a moment's rest. The expedition turned into a catastrophe. The Russians lost 3 generals, nearly 200 officers, and about 4,000 soldiers. This was not just a military defeat, but a slap in the face to the entire empire, demonstrating that in his mountains, Shamil was master. The Russian soldiers and officers who survived this hell felt a mixture of terror and respect for their unseen enemy, acknowledging his devilish cunning and tactical mastery. The history of Shamil's rule is also the story of his relationships with his inner circle, his naibs, who were both his support and his greatest threat. He cultivated a whole generation of talented and desperately brave military leaders, without whom his state would not have survived a year. Among them were such legendary figures as Akbardil Muhammad, known as the right hand of the Imam, whose authority was almost equal to Shamil's own; Danial Bek, the Sultan of Elisu, who defected to the Highlanders and became one of their most skilled commanders; and of course, Haji Murat, the Red Devil, the most famous and daring of all the naibs, whose audacious raids terrified the entire Caucasian line. These men were the pillars of the Imamate. Shamil trusted them, gave them immense authority, but also demanded unquestioning obedience. However, a system built on personal loyalty and strength contained the seeds of its own discord. Many naibs, hailing from noble families, secretly resented the absolute power of the Imam, a man of simple origins. They were jealous of one another, wove intrigues, and sometimes even entered into secret negotiations with the Russians. Shamil, possessing not only military but also political acumen, sensed these undercurrents. He maintained a balance of power, moved naibs from place to place to prevent them from becoming too powerful, and brutally punished the slightest suspicion of treason. On the other side of the barricades, he was opposed by outstanding figures of the Russian Empire. General Alexei Yermolov, with his scorched earth policy, laid the foundation for the brutalization of the war. Prince Mikhail Vorontsov, an Anglophile and aristocrat, tried to combine military force with civilizing measures, but suffered a fiasco in the Dargo expedition. And finally, Prince Alexander Baryatinsky, a methodical and relentless strategist who understood that Shamil could be defeated not by storm, but by strangulation. This was a confrontation not just of armies, but of personalities, titans of their time, each acting within his own logic and code of honor. It was this equality of scale that engendered the mutual respect that was so vividly demonstrated in the war's finale. One of the most dramatic and revealing episodes, which exposes both Shamil's character and the nature of his conflict, not only with Russia but with himself, was the story of his eldest son, Jamaluddin. In 1839, during the heavy fighting for the village of Akhulgo, Shamil was forced to give his 8-year-old son as a hostage to General Grab as a guarantee of his submission. It was a military ruse. The Imam had no intention of surrendering and soon escaped, but his son remained in enemy hands. For a Highlander, the loss of a son was a terrible shame and a personal tragedy. However, Jamaluddin's fate took an unexpected turn. Emperor Nicholas III took a personal interest in the boy. He was placed in the best cadet corps, received a brilliant education, became an officer in the Russian army, and was accepted into the high society of St. Petersburg. He effectively became a Russian aristocrat, forgetting his native language and customs. 15 years later, in 1854, during a raid into Kakheti, Shamil's Murids captured two Georgian princesses of the Chavchavadze family, relatives of the imperial family. The Russian command proposed a deal: exchanged the noble captives for Jamaluddin. For Shamil, this was a moment of truth. On one hand, the father in him spoke, yearning for his firstborn and dreaming of his return. On the other, the Imam spoke, the head of state, for whom exchanging his son for women would be a sign of weakness and a violation of all principles of equality before Sharia. His comrades begged him to agree, but he hesitated for a long time. Finally, he delivered his verdict, which became legendary. According to one version, he said, "I cannot exchange a single Muslim, not even the lowliest, for my family." According to another, more famous version, he proclaimed, "One does not trade a common soldier for a field marshal." In the end, the exchange took place under pressure from the Divan. But this internal conflict, this sacrifice of fatherly feelings for the sake of an idea, demonstrated to all, both his own people and his enemies, the unshakable firmness of his principles. He was ready to sacrifice the most precious thing he had for what he considered his duty, and this tragic integrity of his nature commanded immense respect even from those who considered him their enemy. By the end of the 1840s, Imam Shamil had reached the zenith of his power. The territory of the Imamate covered almost all of Chechnya and mountainous Dagestan. His influence extended to Circassia, and his name was spoken with hope and admiration in Istanbul, Paris, and London, where he was seen as a natural ally in the struggle against Russian expansion. During this period, he felt himself the absolute master of the Caucasus. His army, hardened in battle, numbered up to 60,000 warriors. His system of governance worked like clockwork, supplying the front with everything it needed. A series of brilliant military victories, especially the humiliating defeat of Vorontsov's Dargo expedition, created an aura of invincibility around him. It seemed that the Russian war machine was powerless against his genius and the courage of his Murids. It was at this moment, as often happens with great men, that an element of hubris, the ancient pride that challenges fate, began to appear in his actions. Believing in his own star, Shamil started to shift from defensive guerrilla warfare to daring offensive operations. His detachments conducted deep raids beyond the Caucasian line, attacking Cossack villages, burning fortresses, and taking prisoners. He began to see himself not just as a leader of highlanders, but as a regional sovereign capable of speaking on equal terms with the Russian emperor. This self-confidence, fueled by success, led him to a series of strategic miscalculations. He underestimated the colossal, almost inexhaustible resources of the Russian Empire. He believed he could exhaust Russia, force it to abandon its conquest of the Caucasus. He failed to see that each of his victories, each daring raid, only strengthened St. Petersburg's resolve to put an end to the Caucasian ulcer at any cost. The peak of his power became the beginning of his end. The empire, having learned painful lessons, began to change its strategy, moving from cavalry charges to a slow, methodical siege. And Shamil, blinded by glory, did not immediately notice how the iron ring began to slowly but inexorably tighten around his mountain kingdom. Invisible cracks, harbingers of the coming catastrophe, began to appear in the seemingly monolithic structure of the Imamate long before its fall. The main cause was the war itself, which had now lasted for a generation. The endless strain, human losses, and economic hardships began to erode the spirit of the mountain peoples. The population, which had initially embraced the ideas of Gazavat with enthusiasm, grew tired of the perpetual bloodshed. Fields lay unsown, trade came to a standstill, and the requisitions by Shamil's naibs became increasingly burdensome. Against this backdrop, the tactics of the Russian Empire also began to change. Instead of sending cumbersome, vulnerable expeditions into the mountains, Russian forces, under a new generation of generals like Baryatinsky, shifted to a strategy of slow strangulation. They began a systematic clearing of the guerrilla forests that served as the highlanders' cover. A network of powerful fortresses was built across the Caucasus, connected by clearings and roads that dissected the Imamate's territory into isolated pockets. This anaconda tactic deprived Shamil of his main advantage, mobility. Simultaneously with military force, the empire actively used soft power. The Russian command began an active propaganda campaign, promising amnesty, tax breaks, and the preservation of property to those villages and communities that voluntarily defected to Russia. Gold and promises began to work where bayonets had failed. Many elders, dissatisfied with Shamil's harsh dictatorship and the abolition of their familiar adats, began to enter into secret negotiations. The Imamate began to erode from within. Shamil saw these alarming signs. He tightened discipline, introduced new, even harsher laws, and executed for the slightest disobedience. But these measures, intended to strengthen his power, often had the opposite effect, only intensifying the silent discontent. The immense fatigue that had accumulated among the people was becoming a time bomb, planted at the foundation of his state. The turning point, the fateful act that sealed the doom of the Imamate and turned a smoldering war into a personal vendetta for the Russian throne, was the daring raid into Kakheti, Georgia, in the summer of 1854. This raid was conceived by Shamil as a demonstration of strength and a response to the tightening Russian blockade. He placed his son, Ghazi Muhammad, at the head of a 20,000-strong army. The Highlanders broke through the Lezgin cordon line, stormed into the flourishing Alazani Valley, and descended upon the Tsinandali estate, which belonged to Prince David Chavchavadze, a famous poet and a general in the Russian service. The prince himself was absent, but his family was at the estate. His wife, Princess Anna, her sister, Princess Varvara Orbeliani, and their many children. The women and children were taken captive and brought, as the greatest of trophies, to the Imamate's capital, the village of Vedeno. For Shamil, this was a triumph. He held not just noble captives, but relatives of high-ranking imperial dignitaries, close to the imperial court. He expected a huge ransom and a loud political resonance that would show the world that the Imamate was a force to be reckoned with. However, he miscalculated in one crucial aspect: the psychology of his enemy. The capture of women and children, from the perspective of 19th-century European aristocratic morality, was an act of unheard-of barbarism. The news shocked St. Petersburg. Emperor Alexander II, who personally knew the Chavchavadze family, took it as a personal insult. The war ceased to be merely a geopolitical task. It acquired an emotional dimension. New elite troops were sent to the Caucasus with a single order: to crush Shamil at any cost and free the captives. This raid, which brought Shamil a tactical advantage. He eventually exchanged the princesses for his son Jamaluddin and a colossal ransom, turned into a strategic catastrophe for him. He had awakened a sleeping beast and focused upon himself the full might and hatred of the Russian Empire, which would not now relent until the last stronghold of the Imamate was wiped from the face of the earth. While the iron ring of the Russian blockade tightened from the outside, processes of internal decay were accelerating within the imamate, proving to be just as fatal to Shamil's state as enemy bayonets. The 25 years of continuous warfare that the Caucasus had endured was a total war, demanding an unimaginable exertion of all the people's strength. And by the mid-1850s, this resource was almost completely exhausted. The imamate's economy, based on agriculture and raids, was in a state of collapse. The Russian scorched earth tactics and deforestation deprived the highlanders of pastures and arable land. Constant mobilizations tore men away from their farms, leading to famine. Against this backdrop, the Imam's iron dictatorship, initially seen as a necessary condition for survival, began to cause growing irritation. The Naibs, endowed by Shamil with immense local power, often abused it, imposing unbearable taxes and acting arbitrarily. Shamil himself, increasingly withdrawn under the weight of responsibility, grew suspicious and harsh. He distanced himself from many old, trusted comrades, surrounding himself with flatterers and informers. The system, built on his personal authority, began to falter as soon as that authority started to waver. The Russian command skillfully exploited these internal contradictions. Through spies and defectors, disinformation was purposefully spread in the villages still loyal to Shamil. Rumors circulated that the Imam was secretly amassing treasure to flee to Turkey, abandoning his people to their fate. He was accused of violating adats, of unjust executions, and of imposing crippling taxes. At the same time, the policy of amnesty announced by Baryatinsky was presented as an act of mercy from the White Tsar, who was ready to forgive his lost children. Anyone who voluntarily laid down their arms was not only spared, but had their property returned, was exempted from taxes for several years, and was guaranteed freedom of religion. For a population exhausted by endless war, this was a powerful temptation. The contrast between the harsh, ascetic, and deprived life in the imamate and the promise of a peaceful, prosperous future under Russian rule was too great. Russian generals held demonstrative receptions for surrendered naibs and elders, showering them with expensive gifts, ranks, and gold. These scenes became the best form of propaganda. The common Highlander saw that defecting to the Russians brought not shame, but honor and well-being. This war for mines proved more terrible for Shamil than the war of bayonets. He could respond to a military strike, but he could not counter this quiet, insidious propaganda that was rotting his state from within. His authority, based on the idea of uncompromising struggle, melted away with each passing day. People increasingly asked themselves, for what cause should they die, if even their leaders were choosing peace and comfort? The new strategy of the Russian Empire, which took its final form with the appointment of Prince Alexander Baryatinsky as commander-in-chief in the Caucasus in 1856, was brilliant in its simplicity and ruthlessness. Baryatinsky and his ingenious chief of staff, Dmitry Milyutin, a future minister of war, analyzed all the mistakes of their predecessors. They understood that trying to defeat Shamil in a single decisive battle or storming his mountain fortresses was like cutting the heads off a hydra. Instead, they developed a plan of slow, methodical strangulation, which went down in history as the tightening ring tactic. The essence of the plan was not to chase the elusive detachments of highlanders, but to systematically cut off the imamate from the outside world and deprive it of its resources. Large-scale construction of new fortresses and roads began, which, like tentacles, penetrated the body of the enemy's territory, cutting off one district from another. Huge engineering battalions were engaged in clearing forests, the partisans' main cover. Where there had once been impenetrable thickets, now lay wide clearings, completely exposed to Russian artillery. This tactic deprived Shamil of his room for maneuver and his main advantage, surprise. At the same time, the strictest economic blockade was established. All trade was cut off, especially the delivery of salt and lead, without which warfare was impossible. But the main element of the new strategy was political work with the population. Baryatinsky announced that Russia was not at war with the peoples of Chechnya and Dagestan, but with the tyranny of Shamil. Anyone who voluntarily laid down their arms was guaranteed their life, property, and freedom of worship. This combination of military force, engineering thought, and diplomatic cunning proved fatal for the imamate. Shamil found himself in the position of a beast around which slowly, step by step, an iron cage was being built, from which there was no escape. He could win individual skirmishes, set up ambushes, but he was powerless to stop this relentless juggernaut that was slowly grinding his state to dust. The key moment that marked the beginning of the imamat's death throes was the fall of Chechnya. Throughout the war, it was Chechnya, with its dense forests and fertile plains, that had been Shamil's main pillar of support. It served as the breadbasket, supplying food for the entire state, and the primary source of recruits for his army. The Chechens were considered among the bravest and most devoted warriors of the Ghazavat. Shamil well understood the strategic importance of this region. Having placed his capital, first Dargo and then Vedeno, in the Chechen mountains. However, it was precisely at Chechnya that the main blow of the Russian army was directed, under the command of General Yevdokimov, acting within Baryatinsky's overall plan. Throughout 1857 and 58, Russian troops, methodically clearing forests and building roads, advanced step by step deep into Chechen territory. The resistance was desperate. Every village had to be taken by storm. Every gorge became an arena of bloody clashes. But the forces were too unequal. The Russian army used new rifled weapons, which far surpassed the old flintlock muskets of the highlanders in range and accuracy. Gradually, village by village, society by society, Chechnya fell under Russian control. Many Chechen elders, seeing the hopelessness of further resistance and weary of war, entered into negotiations and swore allegiance to the Tsar. The loss of Chechnya was a catastrophe for Shamil. He lost not only his main food and mobilization base, but also his moral support. The unity of the highlanders, which he had so painstakingly built over 2 decades, collapsed. He was now trapped in his native rocky Dagestan, surrounded on all sides by enemy troops and former allies who had defected to the enemy. The path of retreat was cut off. The anaconda's coil had tightened, and the end was only a matter of time. In parallel with military and economic pressure, the Russian command waged a powerful psychological war aimed at undermining the morale of the highlanders and destroying Shamil's authority from within. The empire's propaganda machine worked subtly and effectively, using knowledge of local customs and psychology. Through spies, merchants, and defectors, disinformation was deliberately spread in the villages, still under Shamil's control. Rumors were circulated that the Imam was secretly hoarding treasures to escape to Turkey, abandoning his people to their fate. He was accused of violating adats, of unjust executions, and of imposing unbearable taxes. At the same time, the policy of amnesty announced by Baryatinsky was presented as an act of mercy from the White Tsar, who was ready to forgive his lost children. Anyone who voluntarily laid down their arms was not only spared their life, but also had their property returned, was exempted from taxes for several years, and was guaranteed freedom of religion. For a population exhausted by endless war, this was a powerful temptation. The contrast between the harsh, ascetic, and deprived life in the imamate and the promises of a peaceful, prosperous future under Russian rule was too great. Russian generals held demonstrative receptions for surrendered naibs and elders, showering them with expensive gifts, ranks, and gold. These scenes became the best form of propaganda. The common Highlander saw that defecting to the Russians brought not shame, but honor and well-being. This war for mines proved more terrible for Shamil than the war of bayonets. He could respond to a military strike, but he could not counter this quiet, insidious propaganda that was rotting his state from within. His authority, based on the idea of uncompromising struggle, melted away with each passing day. People increasingly asked themselves, for what cause should they die, if even their leaders were choosing peace and comfort? Nothing symbolized the agony of the imamate as vividly and tragically as the fate of Haji Murat, the most celebrated and desperately brave of Shamil's naibs. This Avar warrior, nicknamed the Red Devil by the Russians for his courage and elusiveness, was a living legend of the Caucasus. His raids were like lightning strikes, his name inspiring superstitious terror in Cossack villages and fortress garrisons. He was Shamil's right hand, his most successful commander, and a symbol of the indomitable mountain spirit. However, a hidden tension always existed between the two titans. Haji Murat, a man of noble birth, could never truly accept the absolute power of Shamil, whom he considered an upstart. The Imam, in turn, was jealous of his naib's fame and suspected him of separatist ambitions. At the end of 1851, this hidden conflict erupted into an open breach. Believing an informant, Shamil secretly ordered Haji Murat's arrest. Upon learning this, the naib took a desperate step. He fled the imamate and defected to the Russians. For the Russian command, this was a priceless gift. They received him with honors, seeing him as the key to victory over Shamil. Haji Murat promised to win over all of Dagestan to Russia in exchange for help in his fight against the Imam and the return of his family, held hostage by Shamil. However, the Russians never fully trusted him, viewing him as a dangerous and unpredictable ally. They stalled, keeping him in a state of honorable captivity. In despair, Haji Murat made his final, insane move. He attempted to flee back into the mountains. A pursuit caught up with him near the village of Nuka. With a handful of his Murids, he fought an unequal battle. He fought like a lion, killing several of his pursuers, but was riddled with bullets. His severed head was sent to Tiflis as proof of his death. Haji Murat's demise was a terrible blow to everyone. For the Russians, it was the loss of a valuable ally. For the Highlanders, a symbol that even the greatest heroes were doomed. This tragedy, immortalized by Leo Tolstoy, became a requiem for the entire Caucasus, showing that in this fratricidal war, there were no right or wrong, only victims of an inexorable historical tragedy. In addition to superiority in numbers and organization, by the final stage of the war, the Russian Empire had gained another decisive advantage, a technological one. While at the beginning of the conflict, the weaponry of the Russian infantry and the Highlanders was roughly comparable. Smooth-bore flintlock muskets, effective at short ranges. By the mid-1850s, a true revolution had occurred. The Russian army in the Caucasus began to receive new rifled muskets and carbines. These weapons had 2 to 3 times the range and accuracy of the Highlanders' guns. This completely changed the tactics of battle. Previously, Murids, hidden behind rocks and trees, could pick off Russian officers and soldiers with impunity, as the Russians simply could not reach them with their fire. Now, Russian rifle chains could deliver effective fire from a distance of 600 to 800 paces, keeping the enemy out of range. The Highlanders' advantage in marksmanship was nullified. Furthermore, the quality and quantity of Russian artillery had significantly improved. New gun systems could destroy mountain towers and barricades that were once considered impregnable. But just as important as weapons were the engineering troops. The pioneers, as they were then called, worked true miracles. They laid roads and clearings through impassable forests, built bridges over turbulent mountain rivers, and erected forts and fortifications at strategically important points. Every step forward by the army was consolidated by the creation of military infrastructure. This deprived Shamil of his greatest ally, the wild, untamed nature of the Caucasus. The mountains ceased to be his fortress and became a theater of military operations dominated by the engineering thought and technological might of the empire. Shamil, whose industry was limited to artisanal workshops for repairing weapons, could offer nothing against this technological onslaught. He found himself in the position of a warrior with a saber facing a cannon. His courage and genius remained with him, but they were powerless against the relentless march of progress. Deprived of his main support, Chechnya, Imam Shamil, with the remnants of his loyal Murids, was forced to retreat to his citadel, the impregnable mountains of his native Dagestan. The territory of the Imamate, which once covered vast areas, had shrunk like a peau de chagrin to a few mountain valleys. But even here, the Russian command gave him no respite. Baryatinsky's plan to strangle the Imamate was entering its final phase. Russian troops, divided into several detachments, began a concentric offensive on Dagestan from different directions. From the north advanced the detachment of General Yevdokimov. From the east, from the Caspian Sea, the detachment of General Wrangel. And from the south, from Georgia, the detachment of Prince Melikov. Shamil was caught in a ring of fire. He tried to maneuver, shifting his few forces from one threatened sector to another, setting ambushes and launching desperate counterattacks. But these were the death throes of a dying organism. Every battle, even a successful one, only reduced the number of his already few warriors. The Dagestani societies, seeing the futility of further resistance and intimidated by the fate of Chechnya, one by one declared their submission to the Russian Tsar. Betrayal became commonplace. Naibs who had sworn allegiance to the Imam yesterday now met the Russian troops with bread and salt. Shamil watched with bitterness as the work of his entire life crumbled before his eyes. He was like the captain of a sinking ship, trying to patch the holes to the very end while the crew was already jumping overboard. His world had narrowed to a few villages, and his army to a handful of the most fanatical and devoted Murids, ready to die with him. The retreat into Dagestan was no salvation. It merely postponed the inevitable end, turning it into a prolonged, agonizing ordeal. On the 1st of April, 1859, the last major stronghold and official capital of the Imamate, the village of Vedeno, fell. This fortress, located in a deep gorge and surrounded by several lines of fortifications, was considered impregnable. It housed Shamil's palace, his chancellery, arsenals, and treasury. The capture of Vedeno had immense symbolic significance. Huge forces under the command of General Yevdokimov were assembled for the assault. The siege was long and bloody. Russian sappers, under withering fire, laid trenches and dug mines under the fortress's bastions. Artillery maintained a continuous bombardment, turning the village's buildings into ruins. The defenders, inspired by Shamil himself, fought with the desperation of the doomed. They made daring sorties and charged into bayonet attacks, but the forces were too unequal. When it became clear that holding Vedeno was impossible, Shamil, with his family and a small detachment of Murids, managed to break through the encirclement under the cover of night and escape higher into the mountains. The fall of the capital had a devastating effect on the remaining loyal Highlanders. Many realized that the war was definitively lost. For Shamil, this was not just a military loss, but a personal one. He had lost his home, his archives, the symbols of his power. He was now not the head of a state, but an exile in his own country, a fugitive hunted by the army of the most powerful empire in the world. He had only one last bastion left, one final refuge where he could either meet an honorable death in battle or perform the final act of his great tragedy. That place was Mount Gunib. Mount Gunib in Dagestan became the final stage for the great drama of Imam Shamil. It was a natural fortress, a plateau atop a mountain surrounded by almost sheer cliffs, accessible only by a few narrow, well-defended paths. Here, in a small village on the summit, Shamil decided to make his last stand. With him were no more than 400 people, including women and children. These were the most loyal, the most fanatical of his Murids, those who preferred death to captivity. Against this handful was assembled the entire Caucasian army, about 70,000 soldiers and officers under the personal command of Field Marshal Baryatinsky. The ring of encirclement was tight and impenetrable. Baryatinsky, wishing to avoid further bloodshed and holding immense respect for his enemy, repeatedly offered Shamil honorable terms of surrender, guaranteeing life and dignified treatment for him and his family. But the Imam, true to his warrior's code, refused, stating that he preferred death in battle. The siege began. Russian artillery, dragged with incredible difficulty onto neighboring heights, began a methodical bombardment of the plateau. Special volunteer detachments of Russian soldiers and loyal Dagestanis, using ladders and ropes, climbed the sheer cliffs under the cover of night, trying to gain a foothold on the plateau. The fighting was for every ledge, for every stone. The Highlanders, despite their small numbers, defended themselves desperately, throwing rocks and logs at the attackers, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. But with each hour, their strength waned. The situation of the besieged became hopeless. Food and water supplies were running out. The cries of women and children echoed over the last stronghold of the Imamate, mingling with the roar of cannons and the screams of the dying. The end of the tragedy was near. Inside the besieged village of Gunib, not only a military but also a deep human drama was unfolding. Shamil, a gray lion trapped in a cage, faced the most difficult choice of his life. His warrior's honor, his faith, his entire past, demanded one thing: to die with a weapon in his hands, as befits an imam and a warrior of Ghazavat. He yearned for this death, seeing it as the only worthy end to his struggle. However, he was not alone. Beside him were his family, wives and children, and the last 400 followers who shared his fate. They were exhausted, their morale broken. The women and elders, seeing the inevitability of destruction, tearfully begged him to stop the senseless bloodshed and accept Baryatinsky's terms to save the lives of those remaining. Shamil was torn apart. On one side was the duty of a warrior demanding sacrifice. On the other was the duty of a leader responsible for the lives of his people. To choose death meant condemning all who trusted him to certain doom. To surrender meant betraying everything he had fought for 25 years and covering himself in shame in the eyes of posterity. This internal struggle was more terrible for him than any battle. He spent his nights in prayer, seeking an answer from the Almighty. His comrades saw his torment. They understood that further resistance was collective suicide. The pressure on him grew with each passing hour. Finally, after long and agonizing hesitation, as Russian soldiers were already storming the village and fighting in its streets, he made his decision. He chose life, not for himself, but for those who were with him. He decided to sacrifice his martial glory to save the last remnants of his people. It was not an act of cowardice, but an act of the greatest humility and the last, most difficult sacrifice. The finale of the Caucasian War turned out to be unlike anything anyone could have imagined. On the 25th of August, 1859, when Shamil descended from Gunib and stood before Prince Baryatinsky, everyone expected a scene of a vanquished enemy's humiliation. But instead, the world witnessed an act of unprecedented chivalry. Shamil was received not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. His journey across Russia to St. Petersburg resembled a triumphal procession. In every city he stopped, crowds of people eager to see the living legend greeted him. Generals and dignitaries considered it an honor to be introduced to him. The culmination was his reception by Emperor Alexander II at Tsarskoye Selo. Shamil, expecting a harsh sentence, was astonished by the cordiality and respect shown to him by the Russian monarch. Instead of Siberia or the dungeons of the Peter and Paul fortress, he was assigned a residence in Kaluga, where a spacious house was rented for him and his family, and he was granted an enormous allowance for the time: 20,000 rubles a year. This was not just a pardon. It was a political gesture of incredible power. The empire was demonstrating to the world, and primarily to the other peoples of the Caucasus, its magnanimous policy. Fierce resistance leads to destruction, but an honorable surrender is rewarded with mercy and honor. However, behind this political calculation lay something more: a sincere, deep respect for the personality of the defeated enemy. The Russian military aristocracy, raised on codes of honor, saw in Shamil not a savage but an equal, a sovereign, a warrior, a man of unbending will and tragic destiny. By giving him such a reception, they paid tribute to his greatness and in doing so magnified their own victory, for defeating such an enemy was doubly honorable. The ironic finale of this story showed that sometimes respect can be a more powerful weapon than bayonets and cannons. The years Shamil spent in honorable exile became the final, amazing act of his life, one that definitively shaped his legend in the eyes of Russian society. Life in Kaluga, and later in Kiev, was starkly different from anything he had known. From a stern warrior ascetic, he transformed into an object of universal curiosity and admiration. The Russian intelligentsia, writers, artists, and military men sought his acquaintance. They saw in him not the bloodthirsty fanatic portrayed by propaganda, but a living embodiment of the heroes of Homer or Walter Scott, a noble, wise, and tragic old man. Shamil, in turn, studied this new culture with interest. He learned the Russian language, read books, and discovered with amazement the achievements of technological progress: the railway, the telegraph. He maintained his sense of dignity, never complaining about his fate, and communicated with unfailing politeness to everyone, from the governor to ordinary townspeople. His days were spent in prayer, reading the Quran, and conversing with visitors. In 1869, Emperor Alexander II, as a sign of special favor, fulfilled the old Imam's last and most cherished dream. He allowed him to make the Hajj to Mecca. It was an unprecedented gesture. Shamil's departure from Russia was arranged with great honors. His journey took him through Istanbul, where he was enthusiastically received by the Ottoman Sultan, who saw him as a hero of the entire Islamic world. After completing his pilgrimage, Shamil settled in the holy city of Medina, where he spent the remainder of his days. He died in February of 1871 and was buried in the Jannat al-Baqi cemetery, near the graves of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. Thus ended the earthly journey of a man who was born in an obscure Dagestani village, created a powerful state in the mountains, fought a great empire for a quarter of a century, and ended his life as a revered elder in the heart of the Islamic world, set free by his former enemy. His death was not an end, but the beginning of his immortality in the memory of generations. The legacy of Imam Shamil has proven to be as complex, multifaceted, and paradoxical as the man himself. Time has not erased his image, but has, on the contrary, transformed it into a potent symbol, which different peoples and eras have filled with their own meaning. For the peoples of the North Caucasus, primarily the Chechens and Avars, he has become an undisputed national hero, an icon of the struggle for freedom and independence. They see in him the unifier of a nation, the creator of the first mountain state, a wise ruler and a fearless warrior who challenged a colonial machine. His portraits adorn homes, streets, and mosques are named after him, and stories of his exploits are passed down from generation to generation as sacred lore. During the Soviet era, official historiography branded him as a reactionary religious fanatic and an agent of Turkish and British imperialism, but even then, popular memory preserved a luminous image of him. For Russia, his figure remains ambivalent and elicits polarized assessments. On one hand, he is the cruel and irreconcilable enemy responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, a symbol of the most difficult and bloody period of the Caucasus conquest. On the other hand, an image of the noble adversary has taken root in Russian culture, especially in military circles, a worthy foe whose courage and resilience command respect. 19th century literature, from Pushkin and Lermontov to Leo Tolstoy, created a romantic aura around the Caucasian War, and Shamil became one of the central characters of this epic narrative. In a global context, Shamil is perceived as one of the first and most striking leaders of the 19th century anti-colonial struggle, a symbol of a small nation's resistance to the expansion of a great power. His guerrilla warfare tactics have been studied by military theorists around the world. Thus, his legacy lives on, refracted in different historical mirrors, but invariably retaining its scale and its tragic allure. Now, having traced the Imam's entire path from birth to death, we can finally assemble all the pieces of this mosaic and provide a comprehensive answer to the main question. Why did his enemies deify him? This reverence was not based on sentimentality, but on a combination of quite rational and psychological reasons. First, the Russian officers and the emperor himself respected him for his personal integrity and asceticism. In an era when many Caucasian rulers easily sold their loyalty for ranks and gold, Shamil was absolutely incorruptible. He lived as simply as his warriors, despised luxury, and remained true to his ideals to the end. In the eyes of the Russian nobility, who valued a code of honor, such an adversary elicited involuntary respect. Second, they bowed to his military genius. The Caucasian army, having gone through the hell of ambushes and grueling campaigns, had learned his tactical mastery firsthand. To acknowledge Shamil's greatness as a commander was also to justify their own immense losses and hardships. Victory over a genius is far more honorable than victory over a savage. Third, they saw him as a sovereign, not a bandit. Shamil created a real state, the imamate with its laws, army, and administration. He waged war not for plunder, but in the name of a great idea, Thus, in the eyes of the empire, he was not just a rebel, but the head of an enemy power. By honoring a defeated monarch, Russia affirmed its own imperial status. Fourth, what could be called political pragmatism came into play. The magnanimous treatment of Shamil was a clear lesson for all other peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Resistance is futile, but an honorable surrender guarantees the Tsar's mercy. Shamil's captivity became the most effective tool for ending the war. And finally, fifth, his veneration was a tribute to a tragic hero. Russian society, raised on classical literature, saw in Shamil a figure of epic proportions, a titan who challenged fate and lost. His resilience in struggle and his dignity in defeat inspired an admiration that was stronger than political hatred. Together, these factors created the unique phenomenon of the revered enemy, turning the story of Imam Shamil into an eternal tale about the paradoxes of war and the human spirit. The story of Imam Shamil extends far beyond a 19th-century regional conflict. It is a universal parable about the clash of civilizations, the price of freedom, and the nature of power. It shows how one man, driven by an unshakable faith in his idea, can change the course of history, forcing the world's greatest empire to become bogged down in a small mountain region for a quarter of a century. His fate is an eternal reminder that history is moved not only by economics and geopolitics, but also by the strength of the human spirit, capable of the greatest feats and the greatest sacrifices. But the main, most profound lesson of this story lies in its paradoxical conclusion. The tale of Shamil is not just a narrative of war, but an exploration of the very nature of enmity and respect. It proves that even in the most bitter confrontation, when it seems that hatred should burn away everything human, there remains a place for acknowledging the valor, honor, and greatness of an opponent. The reverence shown to Shamil by his enemies is a rare historical example of how the human dimension can triumph over political expediency. It is a story about how true victory is achieved not by the one who strikes the last blow, but by the one who, even in defeat, manages to preserve his dignity and compel the victor to acknowledge his moral equality. The figure of Shamil standing before Emperor Alexander II is not just a scene of a prisoner's surrender. It is a symbol of a dialogue between two worlds, two civilizations that, having passed through the hell of mutual destruction, were able to see in each other not monsters, but men. And in this dialogue, born from the roar of cannons, lies an eternal philosophical lesson. Respect for a worthy enemy is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of the true strength and wisdom of the victor.